Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort, a local Champaign-Urbana peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, January 30th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humanae ingeni est odissi cum laceris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. But I want to turn tonight from the present crimes of U.S. militarism to those of 2 generations ago. There's a current movie called The Post, the references to the Washington Post, the newspaper, that tells part of the story of the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers, officially titled United States-Vietnam Relations 1945-1967, a study prepared by the Department of Defense, is a history of the United States' political military involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to the mid-60s. The papers were released by Daniel Ellsberg, who'd worked on the study. They were first brought to the attention of the public on the front page of the New York Times in 1971. This was the Defense Department's official, internal, secret history of the Vietnam War. A generation later, a 1996 article in the New York Times said that the Pentagon Papers had demonstrated, among other things, that the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, quote, systematically lied not only to the public, but also to Congress, close quote. Also, the papers revealed that the U.S. had secretly enlarged the scope of its actions in the Vietnam War with the bombing of nearby Cambodia and Laos, coastal raids on North Vietnam, and Marine Corps attacks, none of which were reported in the mainstream media. For his disclosure of the Pentagon Papers, his leak, as we might say, Daniel Ellsberg, was initially charged with conspiracy, espionage, and the theft of government property. But the charges were later dismissed after prosecutors investigating the Watergate scandal discovered that the staff members in the Nixon White House had ordered the so-called White House plumbers to engage in unlawful efforts to discredit Ellsberg. In June 2011, the entirety of the Pentagon Papers was declassified and publicly released. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had created the Vietnam Study Task Force in 1967 for the purpose of writing a, quote, encyclopedic history of the Vietnam War. The war had begun only 5 years before with the Kennedy administration's bombing of South Vietnam. McNamara claimed that he wanted to leave a written record for historians to prevent policy errors in future administrations. McNamara neglected to inform either President Lyndon Johnson or Secretary of State Dean Rusk about the study. One report claimed that McNamara planned to give the work to his friend Robert F. Kennedy, who sought the Democratic presidential nomination in 1968. McNamara later denied this, though he admitted that he should have informed Johnson and Rusk. Instead of using existing Defense Department historians, the Secretary, McNamara, assigned his close aide and Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton to collect the papers. McNaughton died in an air accident 1 month after work began in June 1967, but the project continued under the direction of Defense Department official Leslie Gelb. 36 analysts, half of them active duty military officers, the rest academics and civilian federal employees, worked on the study. The analysts largely used existing files in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and conducted no interviews or consultations with the armed forces, with the White House, or with other federal agencies in order to keep the study secret from others, including National Security Advisor Walt W. Rostow. McNamara left the Defense Department in February of 1968, and his successor, Clark Clifford, received the finished study on January 15, 1969, 5 days before Richard Nixon's inauguration, although Clifford claimed he'd never read it. The study comprised 3,000 pages of historical analysis and 4,000 pages of original government documents in 47 volumes, and was classified as top secret sensitive. The task force published 15 copies. The think tank RAND Corporation received 2 of the copies from Gelb, Morton Halpern, and Paul Warnke, with access granted if at least 2 of those 3 Defense Department officials approved. It showed that the actual objective of the Vietnam War was the containment of China. As laid out by U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the Chinese containment policy of the United States was a long-run strategic effort to surround Beijing with the USSR, its satellite states, as well as the Japan-Korea front, the India-Pakistan front, and the Southeast Asia front. Although President Johnson stated that the aim of the Vietnam War was to secure, quote, an independent, non-communist South Vietnam, close quote, a January 1965 memorandum by Secretary of Defense McNamara stated that an underlying justification was, quote, not to help a friend, but to contain China, close quote. And a remarkable article in The New Yorker this week, an historian, very interesting historian, speaking publicly for the first time, reveals the crucial role that he and a small band of others played in helping Daniel Ellsberg leak the documents, the Pentagon Papers, to journalists. In June of 1971, Gar Alperovitz, a 35-year-old historian, sped through suburban Boston looking for an out-of-the-way payphone to use to call a reporter. This was a long time ago. He needed a payphone. Alperovitz had never considered himself much of a risk-taker. The father of 2 ran a small economic think tank focused on community building. He had participated in demonstrations against the Vietnam War and rung doorbells with Martin Luther King Jr. in Boston as part of an anti-war campaign. But what he was doing on this day, propelled by his desire to end the conflict, could lead to federal prison. I was living in Boston in 1971 and working with some of these people, although I never met Alperovitz, even though I admired very much a book he'd written. But as I hear this story, as I say, from the current New Yorker, I must admit I am taken back to those days. Alperovitz pulled his old Saab up to a phone booth on the outskirts of Harvard Square and rang a hotel room nearby. When the reporter picked up, Alperovitz identified himself with the alias he had adopted. Quote, "It's Mr. Boston." Alperovitz told the journalist to open the door. Waiting in the hallway was a cardboard box left minutes before by a runner working with Alperovitz. Inside were several hundred pages of the most sought-after documents in the United States, the top-secret Vietnam history, known as the Pentagon Papers. The handoff was one of about a dozen clandestine encounters with journalists that Alperovitz orchestrated over the course of a 3-week period, when he and a small group of fellow anti-war activists helped Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst at the RAND Corporation, elude an FBI manhunt and distribute the Pentagon Papers to 19 newspapers. Ellsberg, who had smuggled the documents out of Rand's Santa Monica office 2 years earlier and copied them with the help of a colleague, has long been the public face of the leak. But Ellsberg was aided by about a half-dozen volunteers whose identities have stayed secret for 46 years, Despite the intense interest of the Nixon administration, thousands of articles, books, documentaries, plays, and now a major film, The Post, starring Meryl Streep and Tom Hanks, about the Pentagon Papers. Ellsberg told me, and this is the author of the article, Ellsberg told me that the hidden role of this group was so critical to the operation that he gave them a code name, the Lavender Hill Mob, the name of a 1951 film about a ragtag group of amateur bank robbers. He's referred obliquely to his co-conspirators over the years, but he held back from identifying them because some of the group still feared repercussions. Now Alperovitz, who is 81, has agreed to be revealed for the first time. Quote, "I'm getting old," Alperovitz told me, with a laugh. Several other members of the group told me they still wish to remain anonymous or declined interview requests. One former Harvard graduate student who also played a major role, she hid the papers in her apartment and organized hideouts for Ellsberg, considered coming forward in this piece, but she ultimately decided not to after conferring with lawyers. As a green card holder, she worried that her involvement could lead to her deportation by the Trump administration. Still, she remains proud of her role. Quote, "Those were extraordinary days," she told me. "It was about questioning the government and being against the government. I was very, very angry about what was happening in Vietnam." Close quote. Alperovitz said that the renewed interest in the Pentagon Papers brought on by the film The Post pushed him to finally acknowledge his role, but he also alluded to the very dangerous climate in the present administration. An historian and political economist whose writings have focused on the dangers of nuclear war and economic inequality, Alperovitz said that Trump's, quote, "outrageous and destabilizing rhetoric on North Korea compelled him to tell his story and to suggest to people that it's time to take action," close quote. "We were trying to stop the war," Alperovitz told me in an interview in his home near Washington. "I'm not heroic in this, but I just felt it important to act. There were lots of people dying unnecessarily. There were lots of people who were taking risks to try to end the war, and I was one of them." Close quote. Ellsberg told me that Alperovitz in particular was critical to the ways this thing worked out, organizing the broader distribution of the papers. Ellsberg had initially turned over the documents only to Neil Sheehan, a reporter at the New York Times, which published the first front-page article on the Pentagon Papers in June of 1971. The Nixon administration quickly secured an injunction to halt the Times from continuing to publish the documents. But it was Alperovitz who devised a strategy of distributing the papers to as many news organizations as possible, including the Washington Post, an approach that later proved to be crucial from both a legal and public relations standpoint. It was Alperovitz who came up with the elaborate techniques for slipping the documents to reporters while evading the authorities. Quote, "Gar took care of all the cloak and dagger stuff," Ellsberg said. The danger to the Lavender Hill mob could hardly be underestimated. Alperovitz would have been indicted in a heartbeat if he had been identified, Ellsberg said. Senior officials in the Nixon White House had become obsessed with arresting and discrediting Ellsberg and any of his accomplices. They created a group of Nixon campaign operatives who became known as the Plumbers to break into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in what would be a precursor to the Watergate scandal. In a 2010 documentary, quote, "The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers," or rather entitled "The Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers," Eagle Crow, one of the operatives, one of the plumbers, one of the Nixon administration operatives, says that the administration was obsessed with identifying who else was involved in the leak. Quote, "Did Daniel Ellsberg work alone? Was he working with some other people? Was he part of a conspiracy?" Close quote. Crow, who was imprisoned for his role in the Watergate break-in, says in the film being quoted, "FBI agents and Nixon plumbers tracked leads from Los Angeles to Paris. The perpetrators, it turned out, met less than a mile from Harvard Square, the epicenter of the liberal Ivy League elitism that Nixon so detested." In early June of 1971, Ellsberg, who had left RAND and was working as a senior research fellow at MIT, hosted a small dinner party at his home in Cambridge, where MIT is located. Ellsberg, who was then 40, had never met Alperovitz, but invited him after colleagues said they shared an intense opposition to the war. The Harvard graduate student, who didn't want to be identified, was there as well. Alperovitz had worked in the U.S. government on foreign affairs from 1961 to 1966, first in Congress, then at the State Department, and it was there as an insider that his opposition to the war hardened. As a Senate aide in 1964, Alperovitz worked unsuccessfully to stop what he still calls the phony Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which allowed President Johnson to escalate America's military involvement in Vietnam. More than anything, the congressional vote confirmed his view that the war was a fraud perpetrated on the American public. At the dinner, Alperovitz and Ellsberg, a former Marine and Pentagon analyst, talked about Nixon, liberal activism, nuclear weapons, and, of course, Vietnam. The top-secret papers never came up. But as the party wrapped up and Alperovitz walked to his car, the Harvard graduate student pulled him aside and made a cryptic comment about some sensitive material on Vietnam and, quote, boxes and boxes of papers, close quote, Alperovitz recalled. A day or two later, the graduate student arranged to meet Alperovitz at a park, and she told me in an interview, she explained to Alperovitz that Ellsberg had entrusted her with thousands of pages of the documents and that she'd stashed them in cupboards in the pantry of her small apartment. Ellsberg had given copies of the papers to a Times reporter New York Times reporter several months earlier, but had not heard from him since. She and Ellsberg didn't know when the newspaper might run the story, or if it even intended to do so, and were eager to distribute more of the papers to other news outlets. Quote, I needed help to do this work, the woman told me, and Alperovitz seemed exactly the right person. When she asked Alperovitz if he would help, he immediately agreed. Decades later, Alperovitz said that his eagerness, despite the obvious risks, still puzzles him. Quote, I'm a very cautious person, but I didn't blink, which I don't understand, he told me. I'm surprised I didn't just say, whoops, I'm busy tomorrow. It was out of character, close quote. In a subsequent meeting with Ellsberg, Alperovitz mapped out a strategy. Ellsberg, who had tried to leak the secret papers to members of Congress, but had been rebuffed, wanted to get all 7,000 pages of the papers out at once, if not in the Times, then in the Washington Post or somewhere else. Quote, my nightmare was that the FBI would catch me and capture all the papers first, Ellsberg recalled. He even considered using the Harvard Crimson's, that's the student newspaper of Harvard University, the Harvard Crimson's presses to print the documents himself. Alperovitz talked him out of it. Quote, I said to Dan, look, this is 7,000 pages of material. You'll get one story, maybe two, Alperovitz said. If you really want to get this out to the public, you've got to break it up and keep the story going. To Ellsberg's surprise, the Times ran its first story on the Pentagon Papers several days later. The Nixon administration quickly secured an injunction to halt publication. By then, Alperovitz was already working the payphones around Cambridge and Somerville to contact a reporter from the Post and get more coverage. Days later, with Alperovitz acting as an intermediary, Ellsberg met with a Post reporter in a local motel room and gave him the entire secret report. After the reporter left, Ellsberg and his wife, who were hiding out in the motel, saw on television that FBI agents had descended on their home to question him. For the next 2 weeks, the Ellsbergs remained holed up, with a Harvard graduate student taking the lead in finding new places to stash them. Quote, I moved them every few days, she recalled. I'd call friends and say, I need your apartment for 2 days, and I just want you to go somewhere else. Just don't ask me any questions, close quote. Every time the couple moved, she crammed boxes of the secret history into her small Volkswagen and moved them along with the Ellsbergs. The one time Ellsberg knew whose apartment he was using, he said, was during the weekend he spent in Cambridge with a friend, Jeffrey Race, a fellow Vietnam veteran. Race recalled watching a television news report with his fiancée about the FBI searching for Ellsberg. Quote, they can't find him, Race told me, and we joked that, hey, he's lying right here in his underwear on the floor taking a nap in front of the TV, close quote. It was at Race's apartment that Ellsberg had his closest brush with arrest. At Ellsberg's request from a payphone outside of Race's apartment, Alperowitz called a friend of Ellsberg's in Los Angeles to arrange a way for him to speak with his children and let them know that he was all right. As Ellsberg watched from the window, Alperowitz hung up and walked away. Minutes later, police cars converged around the phone booth. Ellsberg guessed that the FBI must have been tapping his Los Angeles friend's phone, or perhaps the payphone, in their effort to find him. "We ducked through the window," Ellsberg recalled. "I'm thinking, oh my God, he and his wife left that same night for a different hiding place." Alperowitz asked the administrator of the Cambridge Institute, the think tank he ran, to vacate her apartment for the Ellsbergs for several days. It was a very matter-of-fact thing, the administrator, Nancy Lyons, who's now retired and living in Concord, Massachusetts, said in an interview. She immediately agreed. She saw it as an opportunity to be involved in something larger than herself. Quote, "I might have just been naive, but I didn't have any hesitation. The one concern she had, she told me, was that she'd waited a long time to get the rent-controlled apartment, and she didn't want to lose it if someone found out." No one did. Rent control in Cambridge, my brother-in-law has been very much involved with over the years. Alperowitz's primary task was devising how to distribute the papers to as many news organizations as possible. Ellsberg usually told Alperowitz which newspapers to contact: the Boston Globe, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Los Angeles Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Detroit Free Press among them, but he left it to Alperowitz to figure out the logistics. Alperowitz told me that he improvised the elaborate handoffs. Quote, "I invented this stuff as I went along," he said. I don't know how. Getting journalists interested in the papers, then the most sought-after documents in the United States, was easy. He would call a newspaper's city desk from a payphone, identify himself as Mr. Boston, the code name that got a few references in the Post, and then offer to share some of the papers. Quote, "They were very happy to take them. Everyone wanted to be in on it," he said. The trickier part was handing off hundreds of pages of documents without being detected. Alperowitz and the Harvard graduate student recruited a handful of college students, all ardently opposed to the war, to help not only with mundane tasks like getting the Ellsbergs groceries, but also to act as runners, delivered the papers. During the frantic 3 weeks it took to distribute the documents, Alperowitz typically didn't have time to even read all the papers before parceling them out to the reporters. He simply grabbed a few hundred pages, boxed them up, and sent the runners on their way. Alperowitz usually found out what was in each stack only when he read the news stories. The pace was so hectic that he and other participants have trouble remembering the exact sequence today. Alperowitz can't remember, for example, which reporter he called at the Cambridge Hotel with instructions for finding the papers in the hallway. The former Harvard graduate student recalls a nighttime handoff of papers at an acquaintance's home, but the details are hazy. There were also furtive meetings at Boston's Logan Airport, chosen by Alperowitz because it was a convenient place for out-of-town reporters to blend in. One student helping with the operation was dispatched to Logan to meet a Newsday reporter whom Alperowitz had summoned from Washington. Posing this time as Sam Adams, Alperowitz had the airport page the reporter over the public address system. The student then handed the reporter a note with directions to find a green plastic shopping bag on a seat in the terminal. Inside were the last 2 chapters of the Pentagon Papers. The reporter, Martin Schramm, and it recounted the covert and borderline comical plan in a story last month. As Alperowitz dispatched members of the Lavender Hill mob around the city, he never actually met any of the journalists himself, except for one, the CBS anchor, Walter Cronkite. Alperowitz, posing again as Mr. Boston, called Cronkite to offer him a scoop, an on-camera interview with Ellsberg, who was still in hiding. Cronkite, like other journalists, seemed to believe he was talking to Ellsberg himself. Alperowitz said he did not correct him. Cronkite and his crew rushed to Boston. Alperowitz arranged for them to get a batch of the papers and had a volunteer drive the anchorman to a nearby home in Cambridge, which an associate had lent for the day. The member of the Lavender Hill mob, quote, "drove them around and around and back and forth to make sure they hadn't been followed," Alperowitz said. "If anyone smelled Cronkite, that would be trouble," close quote. The driver declined to be interviewed for this article. With Alperovitz looking on, Ellsberg gave a dramatic interview that aired that night. I remember that, actually. On June 28th, after a final burst of stories in newspapers from Long Island to Los Angeles, Ellsberg agreed to surrender to federal authorities in Boston. A mob of journalists and onlookers met him outside the federal courthouse. Alperovitz went too, watching from a distance. He could not risk being seen with Ellsberg, but he wanted to be there to mark the end of the saga that had begun 3 weeks earlier at a dinner in Cambridge. What struck him most about the scene, Alperovitz said, was the huge throng of supporters cheering on Ellsberg. It was like we weren't alone, he told me. Ellsberg never did any prison time. 2 years later, a judge threw out the charges against him, ruling that the break-in by Nixon's plumbers at Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office had, quote, incurably infected the prosecution, close quote. For years, Ellsberg kept his distance from the people who helped him for fear of endangering them. He and Alperovitz saw each other occasionally at political or academic events, but they rarely spoke of those weeks in Cambridge, both men said. When Ellsberg was writing his 2002 memoir, Secrets, he went to Alperovitz and asked if he could name him in the book. Ellsberg said that he wanted to finally acknowledge the efforts of him and the others. Alperovitz declined. I didn't need credit or blame, he said. Last year, Ellsberg was doing a book signing event when an older woman in line handed him a note asking him to dedicate her book, quote, to the Lavender Hill mob, close quote. Ellsberg looked up and recognized one of the young students who'd helped. He hadn't seen her in 4 decades. After all these years, it was the most amazing thing, he said. Over the last 40 years, a few reporters asked Alperovitz if he was involved, but he always denied it. The closest he came to being identified was a reference to an anonymous intermediary in some news reports recounting the leak. Today, he sees those weeks as a risk he had to take in a historic moment for his country. Quote, I was someone who was trying, along with many people, to stop this killing. It was a moral issue of the first order, he said. If Alperovitz regrets anything, it's only that the revelations in the papers didn't force a quick end to American involvement in the war, as he'd hoped. It would be another 2 years before most American military troops pulled out of Vietnam, and another 4 before the war came to an end. After the deaths, he noted, of 3 million people, 57,000 Americans for nothing. That's an article in the current New Yorker by the author is as anonymous as Alperovitz was in those days, about the revelation of the Pentagon Papers, the Defense Department's official history of the American assault on Vietnam that killed millions of people and was surrounded by a bodyguard of lies throughout the Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon administrations, a war that fundamentally changed American political mood, the American political move, and the last 2 generations have seen tremendous efforts by the American political establishment to recover from the revelations about American politics and the crimes that were committed in Southeast Asia in the 1960s and 70s. You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 5th week of 2018. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. We'll conclude Aware on the Air tonight with the 4th part of the Real News Network's interview with Norman Finkelstein on Israel's blitzkrieg on the people of Gaza. The new book by Norman Finkelstein, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom, has Norman Finkelstein arguing that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the UN Human Rights Council, and other defenders of international law have succumbed to Israel's pressure and whitewashed its crimes in the Gaza Strip. The Israel crimes in the Gaza Strip and America's crimes in Vietnam are the subjects of our concern tonight, and these are things that have been programmatically hidden from the American people throughout the last two generations. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. See No's notes on the blog News from Neptune and on the Facebook page for Aware. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scollery. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Do see the Facebook page for Aware for links to this and other articles. Also a link to Aware's anti-war teach-in on YouTube and other things, including Nicholson Baker's Why I Am a Pacifist, the Myth of the Good War being World War II. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government. Daniel Ellsberg. The rest of the world knows about these crimes. Americans don't. And more recently, Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mandel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. Our guest is Norman Finkelstein, author of the new book, Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. So, Norman, a large component of your book is how human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and also the UN Human Rights Council and
various International Committee and the Red Cross.
But how
British
various
medical journal,
the Lancet. So certain, but especially some UN commissions of inquiry set up to look into war crimes in the occupied territories have betrayed the people of Gaza. That will surprise many people who, would think of human rights groups like Amnesty and see them condemn Israeli actions many times, accuse Israel of war crimes. So explain your criticism of the international human rights community here, maybe starting with the Goldstone report, which was the commission that was established after the 2008-2009 Israeli attack on Gaza, cast-led.
Okay, first of all, just as a context, I think the most important part of the book is the last quarter, which deals with the human rights organizations and their performance after Operation Protective Edge. Professor Chomsky, who even at the ripe age of 89, he did read the whole book. I know it because it took him some time. He started, I think, on a Sunday and he finished it on a Friday. It took him time to get through it, which for me was a gratifying sign. It showed me that he was reading it slowly, carefully. And he said the last part on the human rights organizations, I hope he'll forgive me for quoting a private email. And he is very proper about those things you're not supposed to, but I think he'll forgive me. He said the last part was spectacular, the analysis of what the human rights organizations did. And it was not, I was not happy to write that part. I was so angry. I was so pained by what happened, because anybody who knows my work over the last 35 years will note I've always relied on those human rights organizations. I'm a person of the left, and we're supposed to be skeptical of human rights, bourgeois human rights organizations, liberals, and I kind of rejected that. I thought their work was good. I thought it was honest. It had its limits, but it was good. When Operation Cast-Lead happened in 2008-9, the human rights community really rose to the occasion. One person estimated, his name just slips my mind, it'll come back to me in a moment, that there were about 300 human rights reports on Operation Cast-Lead. Desmond Travers, he was in the Goldstone Commission. And they were quite good. Human Rights Watch alone produced 7 really solid reports. Amnesty produced 1 excellent report, the 22 Days of Death and Destruction. And then, of course, the climax was the Goldstone report commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council. And Goldstone The Goldstone report was devastating in its detail and in its conclusions, which found that Israel's goal was to
terrorize, humiliate.
Punish, humiliate, and terrorize
The people of Gaza.
people of Gaza. But then, as we all know, it was a very painful day, almost as if the gods were mocking us. On an April 1st, April Fool's Day, Goldstone dropped a bombshell in the Washington Post, and he recanted the report. And he
carefully recanted.
It was
obliquely, I should say.
Opaque. It was an opaque
yeah.
Recantation, but recantation nonetheless. He did it without consulting his three other colleagues on the commission.
Who stood by their findings.
Who stood by the original findings. And I devote quite a lot of space to the Goldstone report itself, but also to his recantation. And it's quite clear if you go through it, the recantation was not based on any evidence. The only reasonable conclusion is that either he or a member of his family was somehow blackmailed into recanting. Readers can read and judge for themselves.
Part of what made his conclusion so powerful is that he was a committed Zionist Jew, great friend of Israel.
Yes.
So his credentials, quote unquote, were impeccable. You couldn't accuse him of being a left-winger or having a pro-Palestinian bias.
Totally correct.
So, which then you're saying also then helps explain how he was ultimately blackmailed, you say, or pressured at minimum into recanting. So what was the impact of that recantation?
Well, the impact actually was tremendous. The impact was the human rights organizations got scared. Why did he recant? So people think, well, it couldn't be what he said because he claims there was new information which gainsaid, denied what was in his original report. There was no new information. You go through it, he didn't come up with any new information. So people think, well, we have to be careful of Israel. Has a Mossad, has all sorts of supporters. And so what happened was...
In the case of Goldstone, he faced personal, a personal backlash. His synagogue in South Africa tried to ban him from his own grandson's bar mitzvah. The results. So I'm sure even in his social circle there was extensive pressure after the
and his daughter is Israeli.
Yeah.
As I said, the circumstances of the recantation are murky. My conclusion, which I don't make explicit in the book, but I'm just telling you now, he's probably somehow blackmailed into recanting. And then the consequences were very noticeable. They were noticeable because of what happened after Operation Protective Edge. The next major Israeli operation, 2014. As you will perhaps have noticed in the proportions of the book, the first 100 or so, maybe about 100 pages, are devoted to Operation Cast Lead, because there was such a huge amount of material to work with. Whereas for Operation Protective Edge in 2014, it's just one chapter. And I have to admit, it's not a lot of sources. There were only about, literally, there were only about 10 human rights reports. Human Rights Watch was missing in action. They wrote one unmemorable little report, 15 pages, on the attacks on schools. Amnesty, it was in action. It did write 4 and then later a 5th report. But the reports were complete apologias for Israel. And then the Human Rights Council, originally there was a pretty reputable...
Just Amnesty quickly. Your main contention with them is that, yes, they do document Israeli attacks on Gaza civilians, but then they take pains to say they don't know whether or not Israel's military reasoning it may have been justified or not. And they also talk about, and the farthest that they go in your rendering is this word disproportionate.
Right, they make, to put it simply, because I know we're rushed for time, they make the worst case for Hamas and the best case for Israel. and whenever Israel has no case to make for itself, because you have to remember, Israel barred human rights organizations from entering Gaza. So whenever Israel had no case to make for itself, Amnesty took it upon itself to make the case for Israel,
Right, you
which
point out that
makes no sense at all.
Yeah, and you point out that they often even defer to Israeli official Israeli press releases and briefs as sort of the
As
a
evidence.
yeah.
Do we consider Hamas press releases as evidence? Mm-hmm. So why would we attach any significance, any importance, any evidentiary value to an Israeli press release? Mm-hmm. But the worst part of it is they are fabricating pretexts for Israel when Israel itself doesn't make a case. If Israel doesn't make a case and Israel prevents human rights organizations from visiting the crime scene, then it seems to me the reasonable conclusion is you're guilty as charged. But what the human rights organizations, in particular Amnesty, did was it said, well, since Israel hasn't told us anything, we just have to wait and see. We have to suspend judgment. But if you suspend judgment, then you simply are incentivizing Israel not to admit human rights organizations, because Israel would have two choices. If it admits these organizations, then they're convicted of committing a crime. If it doesn't admit them, then it gets an agnostic verdict. We don't know what happened. If I were a state, I would choose not to admit them and get the agnostic version rather than get the conviction. So what the organizations ended up doing was they incentivized Israel not to admit human rights organizations, because instead of getting convicted of a crime, they got an agnostic version. We'll have to wait to see what an investigation shows.
Right, and speaking of which, speaking of incentivizing, you also argue that because they refused to hold Israel to account, unlike what they did in previous operations, which you say the criticism of Israel in previous operations did ultimately impact its operations and did get it to show some relative restraint. Because there was no such investigative zeal in this case, and in fact some exculpatory actions on the part of the human rights groups, that actually incentivizes Israel to carry out further atrocities in the future.
Yeah, because there's look, the human rights organizations, they did act as something of a deterrent. And let me just conclude, the biggest deterrent of Israel, ironically, turned out not to be Amnesty, which failed them, not Human Rights Watch, which failed them, not the International Committee of the Red Cross under Jacques de Mayo, the ICRC's representative, who was a disgrace, not Morena Ocampo from the ICC, who was a criminal prostitute.
He's a former prosecutor, former international prosecutor for the
He was the chief prosecutor for the International Committee of the Red Cross.
No,
not,
for the International Criminal Court.
International Criminal Court, excuse me. Not the Lancet, the British medical journal, the editor of which, Peter Horton, is another.
That was not, he recanted as well.
Recanted,
they published a letter.
yeah.
And took yeah, okay. Mm-hmm.
The really impressive ones were, strangely enough, an Israeli organization. It was Breaking the Silence. Breaking the Silence, its testimonies were totally devastating.
This is an Israeli group that gathers the testimony of soldiers who served in Gaza.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, the soldiers' testimony, these are not leftists. They're not contrite. They're not apologetic. They're just, well, this is what happened. And they're very matter of fact. That what Israel did in Gaza, the word that keeps recurring over and over and over again, was insane. Insanity. Insane. crazy, nuts, lunatic. That's the words they keep using. But Israel had a real problem with breaking the silence because they were Israeli and they were the soldiers. They were there. And then Israel unleashed, till this day, till right now as we speak, this brutal campaign to crush breaking the silence. Because breaking the silence is the last line of defense by human rights organizations. Amnesty capitulated, HRW capitulated, all the NGOs capitulated, Human Rights Council capitulated. So the last chink in the armor, the last barrier, the last barrier for Israel is the breaking the silence. It was very interesting because all the human rights organizations, they ignored breaking the silence. Now, isn't that funny? This is an Israeli organization. It's Israeli soldiers. They have no motive whatsoever to lie. They served there. But when you read the human rights organization reports, the few that came out, they're not entirely, but they're almost entirely ignored. Why? It's for the reason you mentioned before we came on the air. They wanted to come out with an equivocal conclusion. They'll say, yes, some of it was disproportionate, some of it was indiscriminate, but they weren't targeting civilians, because that's in the court of public opinion, it's the worst charge. Most people, they don't get very riled up by disproportionate attacks or even indiscriminate attacks, but targeting civilians in the court of moral public opinion, not the law, it crosses a threshold. And when you read the breaking the silence, one report after another report, one testimony after another testimony, after another testimony, after another testimony, they keep saying, our orders were shoot to kill anything that moves, and even if it doesn't move. Shoot to kill anything that moves, and even if it doesn't move.
Anything that moves, if I recall right, is a phrase that's repeated many, many, many times.
Yeah, over and over again. Well, it's hard to have an equivocal conclusion when you have operational orders like that, or rules of engagement like that, shoot to kill anything that moves. And what they did, people of Gaza, as you mentioned in your introduction, 70% of them are refugees and children of refugees. They lost their homeland. The last thing they have now is in the wreckage of their lives. The last thing they have is their home. They lost their homeland, but now they have the last possession is their home. Now when you read the descriptions of what Israel did, these homes, these 18,000 homes, they weren't destroyed in disproportionate attacks or indiscriminate attacks. Israel went into neighborhoods, roped off the neighborhoods, brought in the D9 bulldozers, and just flattened whole areas till the horizon. Just flattened entire areas. This was not collateral damage in a war. This was the systematic destruction and pulverization of a people and of their last possession. And that's what you see. I'll tell you, in the longest chart I have in the book, it goes for 3.5 pages, is describing what happened to the homes. Now you'll laugh when I tell you this. I had to go around and ask 5 or 6 friends to choose the best passages because it began as 10 pages. 10 pages of descriptions of how they systematically, methodically flattened these homes. That's what breaking the silence is all about. And now, the worst of it is, Amnesty puts out a report called Families Under the Rubble, in which it pretends that each time Israel targeted a home, it's because there was a Hamas militant there. That was just such a fantastical, flagrant, despicable, and disgusting lie.
Don't they just posit the question of whether or not there was a Hamas militant there? They don't affirm every single time there's.
How would they know?
Right.
How would they know? They go around, ask a neighbor, do you think there was a Hamas militant? Yeah, maybe there was a Hamas militant there. Even if there was, there's another question. Did Israel know the Hamas militant was there before they bombed the home? And are you telling me there were Hamas militants in 18,000 homes? And is that what the Breaking the Silence reports showed? There were no militants anywhere. No, it was disgusting, but I can't completely blame them. I have to be honest, and I'm careful about it, because I know they're in a difficult position. In the past, Amnesty used to back HRW used to back Amnesty.
In terms of they would both put out reports
on all the controversial issues. On the controversial issues is, I'll watch your back, you watch mine, okay? In this particular case, HRW was missing in action. And I know Amnesty was scared. It was in the firing line. But what it did was unacceptable. It would have been better if they just shut up. You know?
Right.
I want to just end on one point.
Well, let me ask you, Norman. Let me ask you. Two questions as we wrap. Why do you think Amnesty and HRW capitulated as they did? And even though they did, and even though their rendering of the Israeli attacks, you think, did immense damage, you still end the book with some hope. So why do you still hold out some hope for the people of Gaza, even despite not just the suffering they endured, but the fact that they were abandoned by people who were once their defenders?
Well, why the human rights organizations did it, I think first and foremost they were scared after what happened with Goldstone, that the Israelis would dig up dirt. It's a real problem. I know that sounds not a particularly elevated explanation, but we're dealing with real human beings. Goldstone was a star, and then Goldstone was destroyed. And they did it to several others. I go through the record, a guy named Christian Tamushad, they did it to a guy named Shabbos. They were taking them down. So, you know, everybody's got skeletons in their closet. And then you begin to wonder, and especially in our age where so much information is on the web, and Israelis are pretty good on the computer, you begin to worry, you know. I think that's not elevated. It's not grand, it doesn't have grandeur. It's ugly. It's slimy, you know, but Israelis are good at that. I think that's the main reason. Second reason is because the Palestinian leadership itself killed the Goldstone report. And so there was a feeling among human rights organizations, if nothing is going to come of our reports, because ultimately they're supposed to produce results, but if the Palestinian Authority itself is killing any action, which is what it did in the UN, at the behest
of the Obama administration and Israel, who they were heavily.
You know, Hillary Clinton boasted that she killed the Goldstone report, and they worked together. But you have to remember, the Palestinian Authority were very happy to see Gaza attacked in 2008-9.
They thought it could actually wipe out Hamas.
Hamas, right? Yeah. So they were happy, and the third reason was that by the time by the time Protective Edge came around in 2014, Israel didn't have a pure record. Its purity had vanished. And so it seemed almost redundant to expose yet another Israeli massacre in Gaza, because we have become kind of inured to it. This is what Israel does. It's a lunatic state. It goes in, destroys everything in sight. That's Israel's modus operandi. So there was a feeling, I think, of redundancy. Do we really need to document this again? We did it already during Operation Cast Lead. This is Operation Cast Lead maybe times 2 or times 1.5. So there was a feeling of it's redundant, it's unnecessary. But I think the main reason was the fear of what happened to Goldstone can happen to one of us. I know they'll deny it, and they'll say, oh, you have no evidence of that. It's true.
So given all this, and again, going back to my last question.
I just want to, one last point. I'm just going to give you a brief, very quickly, an anecdote. I teach a course for free at a local library in New York, at the Brooklyn Grand Army Plaza Library. And not worth going into. I was teaching a class on free speech, and the subject of Israeli atrocities came up. And one person in the audience, he said, well, Israelis would never target children. Israelis would never target children. And then the person who I invited is a very prominent professor, and also, as the expression has, a public intellectual. Not, you would call him left liberal by current standards. And he says, yes, yes, of course they would never target children. And it's like, no matter how much evidence you present, once you have this thing fixed in your mind, there's no way to dissuade people. It's a very sorry commentary on the capacity of reason and facts to convince or persuade. Because you take the case, so it's reported last week, there's a guy in Gaza, he's has no legs, he's carrying a Palestinian flag, and an Israeli sniper right through the head kills him, right? Fires a bullet right through his head, kills him. Okay, that seems pretty horrible. Israel would never do that. It would never fire a bullet in the head of a paraplegic. 2002, during Operation Defensive Shield, outside Jenin, there's a Palestinian in a wheelchair. He has a flag up, a flag. He's on the main road. A tank comes and it just flattens him. A guy in a wheelchair holding a flag just flattens him. And you might remember, because I had a debate with Alan Dershowitz on Democracy Now! And Alan Dershowitz said, Israel committed no war crimes during Defensive Shield. So I cite this incident. He says, it never happened. It never happened.
No,
it's kind of like, you see this stuff, it's documented by Israeli soldiers who are not even leftists. Do you know what they write in their testimonies? They said, we dropped so many bombs, so many rockets. He said, it was so cool. It was so cool what we did. They're not even
game language. So listen,
there's not even contrite.
Even if there are many people out there with the blinders that make them incapable of processing all the atrocities like those that are documented in your book. The point is that this book documents all of them, and it shows a moment in history in which people were attacked, massacred, in your words.
Not were, are, continue.
Are and continue. So I guess, so given all this, and given this horrible history and the obstacles there are to acknowledging it, I shouldn't use the word hope, because hope is irrelevant, as Chomsky says. But what is the path, the possible path to justice, briefly, as we read?
I'm not a religious person, but I certainly go by the adage, God helps those who help themselves. You can't liberate Palestine from the outside, nor should you be able to. It has to be, I mean, well, at some level, of course, if they're if they're facing a genocide, then of course liberate from the outside. But as a general rule, you neither can nor should you. People have to free themselves, because that's the only way that they will stay free. So there's no hope so long as the Palestinian people have given up. And right now their spirits are completely depleted. In Gaza, if you read the polls, all the young people want to leave. Anybody or anyone who can get out, they want out. The polls show about 80%, 70% of the young people wanted to just get out. It's an inferno. They want to flee the inferno. West Bank, it's a more complex strategy, more subtle strategy. What Israel and the international community did was it scooped up everybody in the West Bank who had any talent, any ability, any skill as, say, an organizer, gave them a computer terminal and a cubicle in Ramallah, and said you can be as revolutionary as you want on the social media, just don't do anything. And so there's no leadership anymore. There are no mass organizations anymore in the West Bank. And Ramallah has one of the highest living standards in the world. You know, it's a good life there. So it's a different strategy, but the result is the same. There's no organization, there's no leadership, and the people have given up on collective action. It's every man for himself. There are obviously exceptions, the ever noble and inspiring Ahed Tamimi and her family. There are exceptions.
Palestinian teenager who's currently detained by Israel for slapping an Israeli soldier who had assaulted her, and also
I don't care if they assaulted her. They should smack every Israeli in the West Bank.
Her cousin had just been shot in the face, and
they deserve 10 smacks, and they also deserve to be spit on. They're occupiers. But there are exceptions, but right now the spirits are broken. Now, I'm despairing, but my close comrade and friend Alan Aaron, he keeps saying to me, these things happen in waves. It disappears, and then out of nowhere, you're just surprised, and there's a new insurgency, and the people discover the courage and the will to resist.
The book is Gaza, An Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Author is Norman Finkelstein. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.